Hey everyone, I'm Noctis Corvus, but you can call me Noctis. Before we get into anything and a few days late, Happy New Year. I hope everyone is enjoying it so far, or that the celebrations for it went well. I don't normally do anything for it that's out of the ordinary, but it sometimes feels a bit strange to simply not acknowledge it, if that makes any sort of sense. Anyway, this week we are back with the speed paint of a more recent illustration to keep things familiar, as I do this often. That isn't to say that I'm not planning any new ideas. I absolutely am. Yet some of those will take a bit more time than others to get done, so for now at the very least, we have a familiar video format. So let's look at starting the drawing itself then, shall we? I mean, this actually ties into one of the ideas that I've had in the works now for a short while, which is actually where this idea begins. You see, I enjoy making prints of my artwork, whether it is for myself or for my friends. This year, one of the things that I actually want to do a bit more is to make more prints available and to list the designs that I forgot to in the past, and to simply create more designs for prints in the future that people would like, whilst there are also things that I myself would like. So I was sitting and working on sketches whilst also thinking of things that might be fun to trial or start. Things that I can just give a go with the new year. For a while, I've seen the idea of a print club in quite a few places as of late. In case people don't know what this is, the gist is that you sign up each month for a cost, and then receive a print in the mail, and usually maybe some sort of extra depending on the club and what is offered. This is an idea that I've actually wanted to give a try for a short while now, yet always convinced myself that it wasn't a good idea, or something that people wouldn't be interested in. Yet, with it being a new year, some risks can be afforded, and some ideas can be begun. So I decided with these sketches that now or never. Before I convinced myself that it was a bad idea once again, I would give this a go and simply put something out there to see if people would like it. I mean, I can only try, and if it doesn't work, then I can look at other ideas or try something new. I needed something to remind me to order new printer ink anyway, and this was as good as a reason as any that I could come up with. So for anybody interested, I will add a link below to my Ko-fi where I will be hosting the print club, as I've kind of figured that that would be the best way for me to do it. Each month for £8, you will receive an A5 art print along with a sticker that is themed off the drawing I did. This will also be a print club where, when you're part of it, you can vote each month on the theme for the next print. I know some clubs have yearly or overarching themes, yet I tend to lose interest in those sorts of ideas pretty quickly, which is why, for me and my idea of it, this way just works better, and it's also how I can ensure that each month people would be getting something that I'm happy with and happy to offer, and also something that they would want. Yet that is where this idea begins. See, to start this idea out, I would need to create something that I can show to people and offer for the first month. So this time, I decided on the theme myself based off the sketches that I have been doing at this point, whilst also focusing on creating an idea that would be like the prints that I want to offer in the future as well. Though it wasn't an easy trip, and it certainly took me a while to get to this point, where I kind of knew what I was doing and I had an idea that I was excited for when all was said and all was done. At first I began sketching ideas for characters, as I was only sure that I wanted to draw a fairy. I rarely work with them as they're an idea that I usually overlook, or if I have an idea for it, never tend to see through, since there's something else that normally takes my favour instead. This time I chose the theme of a fairy, and I wanted to see it through, since I was determined that this was what I wanted to do, and that I could actually create something fun with this idea, rather than neglecting them halfway through the process to change the character into something else. Usually when I do this, I get partway through, and then I want to make them a witch instead, or some sort of other creature, as I always find that more exciting by the time that I've done the sketch. So I was making the characters where the fairy aspect was key. I may revisit some of those designs and ideas, look at them for a set or a themed drawing at a later date. But I was having fun as I was experimenting before seriously settling on a single idea. Some of the ideas tied fairies into animals like birds and others to butterflies and moths. At one point I was looking at objects and fairies, yet I was finding that, time and time again, the page was a bit empty and I wasn't liking the idea as just a single character. Naturally, at this stage, I looked a little bit wider at various matters and decided that I would do a full scene and environment that the character would then exist within. I would normally then say that it took me a while to determine where the character would exist, and maybe even longer to work out how the character would be posed or used in the space. Yet this time, at the very least, everything sort of worked itself out and came together with very little fuss. I drew the figure posing, wanting them to be the central focal point, and kind of the thing that people are meant to notice. I wanted it somewhat staged, as if this is a purposeful photo, rather than a snapshot of a random moment like it would seem if the person wasn't looking at the so-called camera, or had been more casual in their actions. The idea I first sketched was posed and purposeful, and whilst I may have adjusted it a little bit later in the process, it was still maintained that this is done on purpose, and the fairy is posed for the scene around them. They're using their magic as they've posed for this. So it was really then a matter of working out the environment and deciding what I would do for that. Personally, I really like the pixie size for fairies and the idea of smaller creatures flying around. I was really using Tinkerbell as a point of reference for scale, as that is kind of the idea that I really enjoy overall when I do think of fairies as well. It also doesn't help that I really adored Tinkerbell as a kid, so that is kind of where my mind goes to when it's thinking of fairy sizes anyway. It's really quite rare that I would think of things larger, unless I'm referring to certain kinds and the ideas that come more from fairy tales and folklore than simple ideas. Yet, regardless, this kind of led me to wanting the scale to show how small the fairy is rather than anything else. Before I could think of anything as well, they stood quite happily on the leaf as I was already sketching the bushes and the plants around them, that then would come to frame the image overall, and along the way and down the line, kind of bring everything together into an image and an idea that would work out rather well. In case you can't tell, I'm quite happy with the way that this drawing came out, and the sketch gave me very few issues for the most part. I maybe only came to change an arm later down the line, as it wasn't looking right, but that was about the most trouble that I had and I took note of. If anything, the hardest part was actually making sure that the foreground wasn't too busy, and that the details were clear enough and to a point that everything wasn't merging into a single shape. It was for a short while in the earlier sketching phases, yet that also sorted itself out the more that I worked on it and in the later parts of the sketching, and it kind of also worked itself out in the outline portion of the drawing as well. Now, speaking of the lines, that was actually what I very swiftly moved on to once I'd been happy with the sketch. This is part of the process that I consider as very optional with the way that I work and the styles that I usually work with. I sometimes do it, and then sometimes go months without even thinking to include it. Other times I will draw the whole image and then decide right at the end that the lines would enhance areas, and that it would be something to add. And other times I remove them later thinking the same way. This time it simply felt right to include them in some sense. I was also trialling a new drawing tablet in this process to get used to it, since I was very recently gifted it by family. So I felt that lines were something that I should at least give a go and try out, even if I didn't keep them at the end. I kind of had the idea in this drawing to trial most processes that I use given the whole new tablet detail, but that kind of didn't play into too much of it since it worked fairly similar to my old one. Now in terms of the lines, this drawing saw them stay. It also saw me trialling an entirely new brush for them that I've never really touched before. Not even in the video I did some weeks ago where the entire point was to try new brushes. Usually for lines I begin by using a darker pencil tool, and then it kind of changed to one of the gouache brushes down the line as I liked the texture and the overall effect. I then kind of just started using a different brush each time that I included the lines to kind of see what worked and what doesn't, whilst also trying to match it to the image. In one drawing, I added some to the end with one of the ink brushes, and then another saw me use a more textured pencil to see if I would like it. I didn't like the pencil, it was a little bit too much, yet I can still say that I gave it a go. That extended into this occasion too. I figured that I could easily give it a try and see if I liked it or not, and then thought that I could make something interesting with how the brush behaved. Lower pressure gave me more transparent lines and thinner lines, which I thought could be quite interesting with some elements of line weight in the drawing. More pressure was darker, and it was almost more like a brush pen on paper, rather than the oil paint that it says the brush was meant to mimic. Though I can't really say how far it behaved like oil paints, given that I've never used them before. Either way, I kind of kept going with it, and I just figured that I would always see what it looked like when it was done in the end. If I liked it, then I would keep it, and if not, I would cut it all from the video and pretend that I never tried it. And that was also because I could follow a more familiar process or use a brush that I knew better, and I could just include that instead. Despite all of this though, the more that I worked with it, I also figured that I could quite easily leave it a little bit messier in sections, and I could use that to say a bit more about the image, which I liked, and so it all stayed. Bear with me here too for a moment. For the person in the image, I didn't really do this. I kept the lines fairly solid, and only really on the wings do they almost vanish at points to help their overall effect. Yet on things like the uneven hem, I used the line weight to naturally reflect how I was drawing it. The weight is uneven and rather thin at parts, but it is still complete and noticeable. Now, applying this to the background, I let myself be messier and loose with the marks that I was making for the outline. The brushes at the back are uneven, and I don't outline the shape of the leaves, or the shapes aren't a solid line either. I instead just kept it bumpy and wavy, and I left wider gaps between it, only going back and filling it in for sections that saw the objects interacting, since that was really where I needed the lines to be. In the main bulk of the bush, I left it as an impression, and I even coloured over the lines to ensure that these marks were a suggestion of the bush in the earlier stages. After all, a person has a solid form and shape. The wings may be somewhat see-through, so the lines there are a bit less important. In some cases, they're more translucent, and they're somewhat less solid in a lot of cases. Yet, a bush, on the other hand, is both solid and natural. It moves more than anything, and it's often changing as it grows, so the lines don't need to be so stable and sturdy as they would otherwise be on a person or a tree trunk and a root. What I mean by this is that a bush changes a lot. There's very rarely a strict line to a bush, and that's why I left it quite loose. It worked out so much better this way in my opinion as well. In the past, I used to dislike when I outlined plants or natural forms, as I could never tell what was really wrong with them. If I thought about it in detail or shape, I would spend more time in the next drawing giving the shape of leaves and being sure to create the impression that I kind of felt that I lacked in the other one. Yet, then by doing this, I ended up with the same issue and the same outcome. It got to the point where, on paper, I wouldn't outline the background in that sort of environment, and only would ever add outlines to solid objects or props. I would outline people and anything they interacted with, but never the leaves and the plants around them. It worked better as an approach, yet I also sometimes disliked the lines making the person stand out more than the things around them, and it was only ever digitally that I would just not outline anything. This situation, partially and loosely outlining matters, seems like a strong contender to fix this issue, as it also helps keep some of the energy from the sketch. After all, when I am sketching, the lines are messy and conflicting, and they're only ever cleaned up when outlining everything, which can sometimes make matters seem a little bit still and frozen. By not fussing over perfect lines or using thin, almost unnoticeable lines, this issue often ends up fixed for me. Or at least it did here, and this is just what works when I'm drawing. I also want to clarify that these are just issues I have encountered in my work. Sometimes I do outline things and I love it, but this is also just more general. Yet moving on, I had to do the flat colours a little bit differently this time too, since I included an outline, but it wasn't as solid as I would usually make it. The translucent sections would show the areas behind it, and the unconnected bits in the outlines kind of meant that I had to triple check if a section was closed or not if I wanted to use the fill tool to just sort it for me. Even then, I had to go back into areas a lot more than I normally would have, just to ensure that there were no white spots or that I hadn't overlooked areas of an object. Most of the time, though, I just coloured the areas in by hand or outlined them again with the colour to ensure that I didn't have this issue. Otherwise, I also employed a trick that I use when painting. It is a fairly known trick when it comes to painting, as a white canvas often leaves white showing through the paint. To avoid this, people tend to lay down a base colour referred to as an underpainting, to sort of eliminate the pure white finish before they start working on that further, so that later, if there are any gaps in the paint or thin layers of paint, the colour shows through instead of the white, and it gives the painting a sort of coherent hue overall. This time, for any cases of the gaps, I kind of just put the background colour image to a dark blue and worked with it in the gaps instead, which is also way less noticeable than any white that I would have otherwise had coming through. Beyond this, the base colours were another simple step that gave me very few issues. I knew the palette going into it since I wanted it to feel alive and like the plants were flourishing, which sort of meant I leant towards more green before anything else. Anything towards yellow or red would lead towards autumn tones, and it would make it seem like the plants were dying for winter, and then anything blue or purple was towards fantasy that I didn't really want this time around. I then figured that the background would be sky, and from there the blues became very good accent colours, that I kind of could include across the image where needed. To then complete this palette, I then included yellow as another accenting option, so that I was using that side of the colour wheel for the main tones, only ever dipping into the other areas of the wheel for shading or later effects in the areas that suited them, and that kind of blended well into the established colours. The only exception to all of this had been the brown for the branches in the image, though that was still fairly close. I had quite a realistic palette with the green and the blue, more so that I then used for fantasy details like the magic and the wings as well, so changing the branches wouldn't have made much sense at that point, and it was a small detail anyway that kind of breaks up everything else around it. Finally, for the colour palette, I could then colour the outline so that it blended together and blended in a bit better than pure black would have. This time I went with a somewhat dark green, given how present it is in the imagery, and kind of knowing that it wouldn't conflict, and then still used a darker green in the further back and shaded areas to ensure that there wasn't an issue with how it looked. Using the green blended well into a lot of areas, and it also made it so that the lines were almost overlooked in most of the image as part of the space, which is what I had wanted. It's seen in the bushes where some parts are visible, yet it still isn't causing conflict or too much contrast, and it isn't grabbing attention away from anything. It instead blends well into it all, and this effect was really finishing off everything, and I finished it off even further by spraying the sections near the lights and the wings with a soft yellow over the green. It's something subtle, and it makes the line subtle, which was really what the outcome had wanted and that I had wanted for it, and what I had been aiming for going into all of this. Now, with all of that said though, let's turn our attention towards the details of this drawing. These are the fun parts after all, and the things that I spent most of my time on with this when all is said and done. So first up on this list of detail is the plants for the foreground, and the bushes and the overlapping objects. I mean, when I was sketching, it was the area that either made or broke the image, and the one area that may have seen me redoing all of the framing and changing the location to better fit the idea that I had in my mind. If it wound up being too busy, then I wouldn't have wanted to continue, and if it was too empty, then it wouldn't have made the right impression that I was aiming for. It was a matter of finding the balance that I wanted and finding the point where it was busy enough that it looked almost overgrown and lively, not like a kept garden or an orderly curated selection of plants. I almost wanted her to be in a forest. This is why I kind of went with a selection of plants rather than a single thing. The bushes were the first part that I worked out and I had been happy with, so that is where we start. These were mostly playing the role of set dressing, filling the space and giving an element of context to the image, while still providing detail that brought it all together. Without the bushes, these being the fluffy, almost shapes that I added with no strict detail, the piece would feel empty, and it wouldn't give the same impression that this is a lush environment of wildly growing plants. Now, on the other side of the very same coin, if I'd added too much detail to them and drawn out individual leaves across all of the bushes in the background and foreground and really overdone it, it would have drowned everything else out in the piece, and I would have lost so much by trying to include too much. The character would have had no chance at standing out. After the outlines and such, I did add a further back layer of the bushes as well. This is the darkest green detail that has no outline and kind of sits behind everything else in the layout. I did this for depth so that it wasn't a plain background, but I also did it to further provide the context from the foreground and to carry over context to all of the areas. Without it, the character was framed by the plants, but still felt a little bit disconnected in a very subtle sense. Yet I wanted the plants to surround them, which is what I did, especially using this back layer. I also pushed it further back with less detail than anything in the foreground, which again gave it a sense of depth and a sense of space. Now, on the other side of things, at the very foreground, I added small details of the bushes between the plants overlapping to provide a bit more of a neutral background to them, and to also help the more detailed leaves and plants stand out that little bit. It was also so that there was another layer in the foreground that pulled things a bit further away and kind of brought everything together that little bit. It's almost part of the overlapping plant cluster, and it is subtle, but it's there either way, and I really know it's there. In both of these, the logic is fairly similar. A layer for depth and detail, something to give interest and space without distracting the eye too much. Yet these weren't the only plants in the entire arrangement. So, moving swiftly on, I next decided to add the leaves to everything. These were an important detail, though it may not have felt like it at first. I mean, I didn't think that they were too relevant when I was first sketching them into everything, yet when I looked at it after, and now, they did a lot for the space and the scale. If anything, the random leaves around the side were some of the main things that set the scale and made the space feel full without competing too much or taking too much attention away. As I kind of touched on earlier, they all began with the one that she was standing on. I considered maybe having her standing on a log or tree stump, maybe even on a mushroom. Yet I went with the leaf as it felt quite fitting for the character that I had in mind at this point. I wanted to include themes of the leaves around them, whilst the leaf also felt more suited for a fairy today. I also knew that with the leaf I could add more of them around it like this, and I did to make it feel more full and framed without being too busy or tying myself too closely to a theme. I might still do themed fairies, don't get me wrong. Mushrooms are also very closely tied into this theme and these ideas, yet this time I wanted to go with the leaves as the other objects would have changed the ideas quite a bit. I mean, as I'm writing this, I am getting ideas for different framings and the themes or ideas that I might revisit later. But for now, the layered leaves made it feel alive, like I wanted to, and it also didn't conflict with the other details that I would later come to include along the way, maybe like a mushroom would have. In everything too, the leaves fit better with the bushes behind them, and it also made more sense with the trunks and the branches in the image overall, since it kind of implies that this is a bit higher off the ground, which I also quite enjoyed, though was a bit unplanned. So yeah, I like the framing better with the leaves, and it was a good way to tie everything together into the plants. By this, I also mean that the other plants would use similar shapes, which is what I wanted for this one so that they all tie into each other whilst being in a similar palette range that looks busy via shading and detail, not busy through too much colour and shapes in one space. It's lively, but not distracting. This is a logic that carried into the stem plants that were included as well. These plants were added with the sole intent to spiral across the page, and to be more detailed than the implications of the bushes behind them. They were details in the corners that twist and turn with the leaves growing off it like the loose ones in the frame, but they were also described as plants. By this I mean that I drew them and I added the leaves and the details to the stem as well. They are simplified, nothing overly complicated, yet they're also more than the bushes behind. If I did everything as an implication, then I feel like I would have lost a lot of the image. It would have been confusing and maybe conflicted with each other more than I wanted, so I kind of ensured that I added the drawn plants, yet used the same theme and appearance in multiple areas to keep consistency, but also then provide the interest of the twisting and the movement of the plants in the foreground that I wanted to include. This was why I included the vines of both kinds. There were those that were meant to be more in the foreground and more noticed by those viewing it that I outlined them, and I kind of kept them in the outlines layer that blended in with everything else. And then I also added those further back that of their own layer without any outlines. These are meant to break everything up and highlight the branches in the image, yet also fill some of the space between the fairy and the background, so that there are parts that are all a bit closer together overall, and to make the drawing feel not as empty. To be honest as well, I also just liked them. They were fun to add and I do it often, and they didn't add too much to the overall image, they didn't distract from anything around them, and they did make it better overall. It's why I kind of repeatedly use this trick in various drawings where I can. But anyway, I think that I have waffled on about plants for a fair bit now. If I missed anything, then I'll be sure to revisit it later if I have time. But for now, I want to turn attention to the fairy, since they were meant to be the main focal point of this image, and I haven't really touched on them once. So far I've talked around them, and they were the point that I had the most fun with, so it kind of feels right that we should mention them here. So I can't really say what made me want to draw a fairy so much as of late. I was kind of just sketching ideas and the idea of a winged figure came up, something that I do fairly often. Yet I didn't want to include anything with feathers. I just wanted to do something different, and I find that I often default to feathered wings way too often, and it kind of then ends up being all that I do. I rarely do leathery wings or anything more fantasy and less seen before, as I always seem to fall towards feathered wings before exploring other options. Part of this might be a world building thing with one project in the works, but even drawings unrelated to it still see me favouring feathers. This time I made a single rule. I can do wings, wanted to even, but I wouldn't be including anything feathery or close to it. Fairy from there was just a natural conclusion, and it was something that I lent into for the overall idea. It then let me draw the environment I liked, and this is a theme that I very rarely explore. As I've also said, I drew a lot of ideas before this one, and they were also fairy related, so I might be more willing to look at it a bit more when considering these ideas soon enough. Now, the first detail of this specific idea that I want to discuss is the wings. These are both the area that I was most excited for, but also the area that I was the most clueless with when it came to working on them. I mean, I knew the shape that I would want, and I had a very strong idea of how I would want them to sit and curl. Yet when it actually came to working on them and the colouring and the shading, I was pretty clueless about how to go about it. I started by outlining them. This was the first thing I wasn't entirely convinced by, and the thing that, when all was said and done, I was most likely to change or remove about them. The lines couldn't be too dark, and they'd then risk making the form too solid. I mean, it was fine. I just had to rely a bit more on using less pressure, and only having the darkest lines where it was really needed. If I wasn't happy afterwards, then I just sprayed some of the areas of the outline with a yellow, so that it blended into the overall wings much more than before, and kind of gave it that less solid form that I was looking for. The second debate was then colouring them. I mean, I focused a lot on ensuring the shape wasn't too solid, so I couldn't just use an opaque pen and call it done. I knew I was sort of limited to a watercolour brush or any other that shared the slightly translucent effect that I was aiming for. For this choice, I kind of figured that I would just give the round brush a go at this point and see if I liked the overall texture, or if I would wanted to go with something a bit more subtle than anything. I figured that after sitting there staring at the screen for so long, I would just have to try one, maybe getting it wrong along the way before I ever made a choice. I'd just do it, see if I liked it, and see if I was keeping it. By the time that I finished the textured version, I actually quite liked how it had ended up, so I kept it. From there, the shading was made up as I went, and I kinda just did whatever looked like it would have worked. And it was a bit of back and forth. I just kinda knew that I wanted some element of shadows and a lot of light. I also wanted to imply points of texture and to simply see what might have worked out for me the more that I worked on it. This was a balance too. I had to be sure that I didn't overwork it or push anything too far, yet I was pretty happy with them in the end. They're most of what I wanted. There's a solid element to the wings, giving them a presence and importance. They are key details and hard to overlook or ignore. Yet they're not too heavy and don't cause any sort of visual conflicts, as that was a pretty big concern as well. They twist and turn, which did pose a slight risk for conflicts and awkward overlaps, yet I think that I managed to avoid them. And on top of this, they're also slightly translucent, with areas of detail behind the wings themselves, kind of creating the effect that I wanted and had been working for. Yet then looking at the rest of her, I wanted this character to tie into the environment around her, which is where the next detail comes into play. When making her dress, I was thinking and wondering what materials this person would necessarily have access to. My answer to this when I started thinking about it was the leaves and the flowers around them, which is where I took most of my inspiration from when it came to designing the dress and the overall effect here. Out of this combination, I actually settled on the skirt idea before anything else, and then I worked out the top half from there until I got what I was happy with. For the skirt though, as this came first, I was looking at the idea of an upside down flower, or something that looked as if it had been made from petals. The thought here had been that, with the scale that this character is, some would likely choose to use the flowers, just maybe not the smaller ones that are around them for decoration. And that by using the flowers, it may lead to somewhat of a decay over time, especially if the wearer is moving and doing things a lot. This is why I didn't have the perfect edge or hem, didn't want something that looked finished, but instead leaned into the idea that this is torn and worn. It may be old, it may also be styled this way in the character's preferences, but it said more about the character to have the uneven hem, which is why it stayed. Even in saying that, I didn't strictly make it just a flower. The main inspiration was that they're round and they're the right scale, and so it would be an option for this use. But I didn't want to strictly denote it to be a flower in the shape, colour, and other normal details that would be expected. I've seen that done, and yes, I like the idea and I like seeing it, but I didn't want to strictly follow that idea this time. It wouldn't say the right thing about the character or the image that I had planned out. Instead, I wanted to use it as a starting point that could be viewed in a few ways. I mainly took inspiration to make the dress shape, and to kind of guide me with what I would then do for the top section and the details around it as well. The important thing here though was what it would tell about the character. The skirt is rather torn and they don't seem to mind, kind of implying that they either have another, can make another, or simply want the skirt like this and it's fine to them. It's not refined and detailed, or anything overly formal for what this character would do and where they would exist at the end of the day. This is also how the top half of the dress came to be. The sleeves are by far the nicest and more purposeful part of the dress, and the overall outcome, yet I still wanted it to look like they've used parts of their surroundings or have drawn influences from their surroundings. It actually started with the sleeves in the respect as well. I mean, I was still referring to the idea of the flower and the forest for this character and their design, so I was actually looking at the other objects and the plants that would be typically expected to exist in this area. I'd used the flower, so to keep it somewhat different, and to avoid drawing a fairy for a certain and singular flower, an idea that I will of course save for another day, I took inspiration from the leaves that I'd added around the drawing already. It just made sense really. I figured I could use the vines from the environment as well to build up support for the leaves as to where they would hang from, which then brought together many details I'd already looked at by this point to achieve the outcome I'd wanted. By pulling from the plants around them, they were at least inspired by their environment, and it added a coherence to it all that I really enjoyed, and it was kind of what I wanted when I started sketching out these ideas to begin with. From there, I could look at the other details to the person that would further connect them to the space and the theme of nature. This is where we begin to look at the flower details in her hair as well and the shoe, since this is a fairly brief point that can lead us into the few final aspects of the character. Yet for the flowers themselves, I'd actually started to sketch with them on the person. I wanted the flower crown since it did tie to the theme of nature, which I had been using as a reference up to this point, and I knew that it would be subtle but interesting for that space that would also help me shape what I wanted the hair to be. Yet when adding to the environment, I used the same process and the shape to convey the flowers as I wanted to add them as well, and I made a point to have them all be the same blue. It's stronger, so it served as a noticeable accent colour in the overall piece, and by including them in the bushes as well, kept a running theme through the drawing. It also made it seem like these details are added from the bushes, and they are taken straight from the space that she exists within. At the same time, the colour isn't too far from the palette, so it doesn't work too much against it, and it doesn't stand out, which is what I wanted. Well, it stands out, but not too far. I think when I finished it, including all the final effects, it actually ended up closer to a green, which I might be inclined to go back and change when it comes to printing this. But for now, we will have to simply see when it reaches that point. However, the flower crown was a detail of the hair that I really enjoyed. It matched the top part of the dress in the sense that seemed purposeful and kept it quite nice. It's an accessory from the environment and it looks like it was made and is looked after. It also added interest to the area as it would have otherwise been rather unconsidered, and I wouldn't have thought too much about the hair and simply left it as a shortcut. There isn't much to talk about for the hair though. I kept it short so it wouldn't conflict with other things in the image and made it green with the palette that I had. I'd already established with the palette that I wouldn't be relying on the realistic tones for this section of the drawing anyway, so I could get away with quite a bit. I chose instead to keep the skin a blue tone, since I felt that it would be fun, since she was a fairy anyway. No rule said that she had to follow expectations, and I rarely mess with unnatural skin tones, even though I'm often inclined to trial the ideas. In comparison, green hair is more believable with hair dye existing, and it was fun. It was also another tie between the character and the environment that I had already focused on up until this point. Green was the best choice for this then, as I didn't want it to be blue due to the flowers, and I didn't want it to be blonde or something else with the proximity to the wings. Anyway, as we were actually getting to the end of this here, the final details were the finishing touches. These are the sparkles and the magics around that I simply added because I wanted to, and that they fit the piece. They were fun and they tied into the fairy theme without getting in the way of anything, and I didn't really see the need to have a reason beyond that. However though, that does bring us up on time for this week. Thank you all so much for watching, and I seriously hope you enjoyed this video as a whole. The script was actually rather hard for me to write, as I wasn't sure how I was going to say certain things and I didn't know how parts would come across, which kind of led to plenty of rewrites and edits until I got to a point where I had something that came across better. A reminder as well that the print club is open on my Ko-fi, a link in the description if people are interested. Either way, I also aim to be offering more prints in the coming year regardless. But I wish you all a wonderful day, and maybe I will see you next time for whatever the next video is. But for now, goodbye!